What's up, everyone? Welcome to Code Porn, the show that has nothing to do with porn and everything to do with trying to figure out asynchronous programming, which is why we have Hatan Shibukshi with us today. Hatan is a Microsoft ASP.NET MVP who runs the LA.NET user group and organizes the Southern California Code Camps. He also happens to be incredibly smart, an expert at JavaScript, and a personal friend. Welcome, Hatan.
Hey, Dustin. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
No problem. So it seems the big thing in languages and development in general right now is asynchronous capabilities. Why do you think that is? What's driving this trend? I mean, we already have excellent multi-threading abilities, in multiple languages, .NET especially, and we can take advantage of multiple cores. So why async?
Well, I think asynchronous programming is particularly important today because of the benefits we get in terms of user experience. So obviously different environments have different benefits and whatnot. But when talking about JavaScript in particular, all of JavaScript runs on a single thread. So we can't really do any multi-threading there if we want to. But what we do have is an asynchronous model of writing code. What's nice about that is during certain operations, like certain long operations, for example, downloading data from an AJAX request or whatnot, we won't have to lock up the app while that operation is pending. So it really gives us a lot in terms of user experience, not locking up your app and just making it a much better overall application.
You're talking about JavaScript as single-threaded. Guys coming from C# or VB or C++, these other languages that have threading capabilities, and these developers that tend to abuse threads, how do they have to change their mindset when working with asynchronous code? Because it seems like a lot of developers really struggle with this async concept.
I think one of the hard parts is understanding that there is a different flow to the application. So, for example, if you've got an operation which is an asynchronous operation, your code is not going to block there. It's just going to run through all the way. And that's where I think people have difficulty at. They're really used to a more synchronous way of thinking. So, like, if we were to look at this in terms of pseudocode really quickly, let's say you had some sort of object that was an HTTP object. So var HTTP equals new. Let's say this was an HTTP client or something like that. Well, in C#, if you wanted to download something off the web, you could say something var data equals, and let's just make something up here dot get, and then let's just say www.google.com. So, and then let's say we wanted to write out data. So console.out dot write line. So in a synchronous world, we would get to this first line, make our HTTP client. We would get to this line, wait until the get comes back, and then we would write out the actual data. Now, if this was an asynchronous call, async, we're no longer waiting here. As soon as we get to this line, this is fired off, and in some other part of the operating system or the application, that is going to happen. But our main app is going to run through, and this is actually going to fail here, but let's kind of pretend it didn't fail. Then we get really funky data that we didn't expect, and I think that's the big difference in terms of thinking with async. So one way that we can get around this is with the concept of a callback, and this is in particular with JavaScript, where we can pass a function in, and rather than get a result back, we can say, here's an actual function. Once you're done, run that function. And callbacks are really powerful.
Yesterday, actually, working with Node, I was just setting up a simple server, and I was reading a file, and for whatever reason, it just wasn't coming over the wire back to the browser, and Fiddler wasn't showing anything. What the hell is going on? It's because I had the asynchronous file reading, and outside of that, it was calling the response.end, so it's ending the response before it was done reading the file. And it took me a while, and then, oh, that's right, I'm because I'm sitting here and I'm not waiting for that blocking call. It's because it's not a blocking call. That seems to be common among this trying to wrap your head around asynchronous operations and patterns when coming from such a long history of synchronous development.
Asynchronous development is hard, and it's a different way of thinking that we're not used to. Fortunately, certain languages have features that can kind of help us along the way. So in C# we have the async and await keywords, which make writing asynchronous code much simpler. In JavaScript, we also have a solution for that, and that's the topic of this particular episode, which is promises. So we can look at that in a little bit.
Yeah, well, let's jump into a demo because that's what we're here to see.
Sure. So let's get started first with the concept of what a promise is. The first thing I want to say off the bat is it's not something that's built into JavaScript. It's not a language feature. Most of the time when people are talking about promises, they're talking about a specific implementation of a particular library. So it's an actual library that you add on. So, for example, jQuery has its own implementation. Angular does. There's a really popular library called Q. But what is an actual promise?
So we're talking about two different things potentially here. Is one is a design pattern called the promise, and then there's what you're suggesting that developers, when they speak about promises, they're actually referring to one of their favorite promise libraries or frameworks. Is there an issue with that? Because you mentioned a few different frameworks. Is there any kind of standard between this promise pattern?
There is, and there is an official promise spec, and it's one that most libraries try to follow. At one point, jQuery ran into a bit of trouble because they deviated a little bit from the actual spec. But in general, people try to be compliant, and I'm sure you can Google it and you can look it up. But it would help to look at the documentation for each library you want to work with. For example, I've got the jQuery documentation here with all the different functions pertaining to the jQuery deferred and promise objects, and we'll talk about what those are.
Okay.
A promise. It's basically, as this really awesome PowerPoint it shows, it's an object that has three states. It could either be pending, fulfilled, or rejected. Now, it's really useful for asynchronous operations because what it lets us do is, rather than having to pass a callback in, it gives us an object that we can hold onto. Here's kind of a really rough example. Let's say we wanted to do an HTTP post to this URL. So we wanted to do something like get the location, then we want to move an actual map, then we want to send off an actual email notification, then we want to trigger dancing hamsters. So the way that we would do this normally is you would have nested callbacks. So you'd have this function that would do a callback into this function, that would do a callback into here, callback into here, and you basically end up with callback hell. Another example of callback hell is something like this here, and this kind of shows the nice hierarchy of what you'd have to do in a complex operation. So let's say we wanted to write an app to go search for Yelp deals, Foursquare, Groupon, and so forth. So we'd have to write a function, inside of it do a callback, inside of it do a third callback, and so forth until we are done. That's pretty ugly. What we could use is we could use something like promises, and that simplifies it for us. So if we were to convert this code into something that used promises, we could have something like this. Now notice here, instead of an actual callback, we're getting an object back from the $.get. And we're actually getting three objects back. What we can do using jQuery is we can use this $when syntax and say when all three of these are complete, then fire off some code. We can also fire off code for each and every single one. So there's a $dot then. So we can say do the first thing, then the second thing, then the third thing. So the nice thing about asynchronous development is it makes it easier because we're no longer dealing with callback hell, and we can basically deal with these objects and we can chain them. So there's a bunch of different functions like the .when here. And if we look at jQuery's documentation, and in this case, do keep in mind we are specifically talking about jQuery. So we have things like .done, which fires when a thing is complete, .when, and all that fun stuff. So if we're thinking about this from a high level again, a promise is nothing more than an object that is going to resolve at a later date. It might be a success or it might be a fail. One of the biggest examples of this in jQuery are all the different AJAX calls. So the $AJAX, $get. Most people still use those with a success handler inside of the configuration. Well, now you can actually return, you can actually get a promise back from the $AJAX function. And that's what I would recommend people use.
So people have been using the promise pattern without even knowing it, which pretty much happens with all design patterns. It just finally somebody put a name to the structure of what they're doing. Okay. So one thing I noticed that you're showing us jQuery, and I was reading up on some of the other libraries. They make mention that a promise should have a then method or function attached to it. So that's how you would chain those together. And one of the criticisms of jQuery is that it doesn't do that.
So jQuery does have a then function, but before jQuery 1.8, then was not chainable, meaning you couldn't do something like this here before jQuery 1.8. Then did not return a promise before. So, but these days it works just fine. Then is baked in.
As far as a promise goes, from a portability standpoint, is it possible right now to have someone using two different libraries where each library is using a promise or returning a promise? How compatible are they?
In theory, if they're following the spec, they should be. In practice, I see that different libraries have slightly different ways of doing things. So I personally haven't really tried to mix and match, but I do know that theoretically you're supposed to be able to.
Okay.
Now, since we are talking about promises, we should talk about the other side of the coin, which is deferred. So I know a lot of people who I talk to, they say, okay, well, I get this promises thing, but what's the deal with deferred? So we talked about a promise as something you get back from a function call or from a library or whatnot. So when you do a $.AJAX, you get back a promise, and you as an application dev, that's what you would basically handle. A deferred is kind of the other side of the coin. If you're building a library and you want to expose a promise out, that's what a deferred object is. You basically new up a new deferred object and you would send that back, and the users of your application, they would basically hang on to that. So let's just jump down here and let's look at an actual example. So here's a really simple function called wait for. It just waits for a certain number of seconds, and then we resolve. So if I were the application dev, I'd write code that looks something like this down here at the actual bottom. I'd say wait for, then I'd call the actual done function. Then I would basically pass in a JavaScript anonymous function that says, hey, fire here when done is called. So this is me as the consumer. Now me as the developer of wait for, that's where I have to use a deferred because that's what I return back. So it's really simple. All you got to do is say you want to build a deferred object. Now, this is an asynchronous operation, and when we talked about it before, we said when asynchronous code runs, the app isn't going to wait for it. It's non-blocking. So we're going to new up a new deferred. We're going to call this set timeout for whatever amount of time. Then we're going to return back. So we're not even going to wait for this to finish. We're going to return a promise object back and say, here you go. When this is done, that's when we want to do this resolve thing. So this is how we would say we are done now, fire the done function, or fire the done function whichever the caller used. Now there's also deferred.fail, and that's how you would report back that something failed.
Essentially, the promise is what you're returning back from your function. It's a handle to this asynchronous operation.
And that's really it. I think now's a good time for us to jump into the actual demo. But before that, I should actually thank my good friend Locke. He's the one who actually made this particular PowerPoint or this particular slideshow. It's really useful. I go back to it myself every once in a while. And if you guys want to download this, I'm sure Dustin is going to put this in the actual show notes. But I do have an actual bit.ly for it. It's bit.ly/js-promise. So
we'll put that in the video description, so you can just go ahead and click on that after you finish watching the rest of the video, of course.
So let's jump into the actual demo right now. Here I've got a really simple HTML file. I am using the immediately invoke function expression pattern here. So what this does is this just basically keeps our local variables and local functions from going into the global namespace. So let's say we wanted to write a very simple app that would use the HTML5 location API to get my latitude and longitude, and we use Google Maps so that we could basically reverse geocode that and try to get my actual address out. Let's go ahead and let's actually write that. So first thing I am going to do is I'm going to do this, and this is the jQuery on load function. That's, this is how you fire code when the page first loads up. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to use a new HTML5 API call for us to get the location. Just one thing to note, this does work on modern web browsers only. So for this, I'm using Google Chrome. So we're going to call the navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition function. This takes in two callbacks, a success and a fail. So let's just log out the value of this thing here. So we're going to write a success callback, and it's going to take a variable called position. Let's just log out the value to see what we get. Let me save that, and let's go look in here. So we can see that we actually did get back an actual geo position. It's got my lat and lon and whatnot. Now I've got some code that I wrote before, and I'll walk you through what this does. This basically gets my current coordinates, gets the latitude and longitude, and builds a Google Map lat long object. And then I build a new geocoder object. Then I say geocoder.geocode with a lat long option. And then I pass a callback in, and then I get the actual county out. I could get the actual address if I wanted to, but for right now, you can suffice it to say I live in Orange County, California, and it writes out the value. We can look at the web browser on the left here, and we can see that it did find my address. So while this code works, this code suffers from multiple nested callbacks. So the first callback is the actual initialization function. Then we have a callback for get current position. Then we have a third callback for when the geocoding is done. If you're new and you're just looking at this, it could look like this is callback soup. Now, this is a really simple example, but you can definitely picture a more complex situation where you're going to do a lot of things. You're going to filter data and whatnot, and you're going to be passing callback into callback into callback, and it gets really hard to manage. So let's refactor this from this into code that looks a little bit nicer. So the very first thing that we can do is we can write a function called init. And then let's just take all of this gunk here and just put that there. So then we could call init down here in our jQuery. And this is an actual pattern I like because this just makes it easier to read, and it actually separates our initialization code from jQuery. So if we wanted to write an actual test for it and whatnot, we could. So that's the first thing we want to do. Now, the very second thing we want to do is we want to get our location. So let's write a function called get location. And now what we want to do is we want to literally take this code here and just dump it in here, and then I just want to call get location. Now, I know what you might be thinking, hey, well, I could have passed get location right in here, and you would be right, but there might be other things I want to do on the page besides getting the location. So that's why I like to have this init function here, because if there are more things I want to do before, then that's where I would put them. So we have our get location, and we can see up here on the left that this is working, and this page, as soon as I save here, it automatically reloads the web browser, and we can see that it did get my address right there. Let's add a third function here called get address. So right now we want to get address. Now we want this to be what fires after get location. So this is going to take in a position. So let's go ahead and let's just take this code here. And what we can do now is we can get rid of this anonymous function here, and we can just say get address. So what we're going to say is once this function resolves, it's going to call get address. Let's do that one more time, and let's call this one update display. And this is going to take in results. And I'm going to take the code from right down here and pop it into here. Now what I can do is I can say once you're done geocoding, let's go ahead and update display. Now I'm going to save the file. Now if you look on the actual left here, you'll see that it took about 1 second, but we did get back expected results. So this is much nicer in the sense that it's refactored, but we are still in that nested callback situation. It's just made to look a little bit nicer. And one of the things about these functions now is they're all tightly coupled, meaning get location needs to know what should happen after I get the location. It needs to know that we call get address. Get address needs to know that once it's done, update display. So we don't get a lot of reuse from these functions, and we do have that tight coupling, which we all know is not good. So the way that we can fix that is by using deferred and promises. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So let's go down here, and I'm going to build a new deferred object. So I'm going to use jQuery for this example, but there's lots of other ones out there. So I'm going to say I want a new deferred object. Then I'm going to automatically, as soon as I'm done, return that deferred dot promise. What we should do as well here is rather than call get address, I'm going to call deferred dot resolve. Now, if you remember before, I said the get current position function does take a success and fail. So let's also deal with the fail condition. So now, if you look up here, I did just save the file. This no longer works. So for us to fix this, we need to also convert get address to use a deferred object as well. So let's do that here as well, deferred. And just like before, I'm going to copy paste this one line of code into here. And here we're just going to say deferred dot resolve. So we are going to say that when this is done, call whatever the resolution function is. So how can we now use this? Well, let's go back down here to our init. Now we can use jQuery and we can say dot when get location. That's the very first thing that we want. Then get address. Then update display. So what's really cool about this is each one of these functions now is completely independent and knows nothing about how it is going to be used. So our code now is much more composable, and we can see that here. And if you look up on the left here, we can see that we've got an actual value now because jQuery now did run through the get location, then fired get address, then did update display.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So it looks like you took that mess of soup, callback soup you called it. You did a little bit of refactoring to clean it up, which helped out the readability. But after the refactoring, you were still tightly coupled to these callbacks. So you had your get address that was being called by the get current position. So if you needed to actually do two things after get current position returned successfully, you would have to then create this, like we call it a wrapper function that would then call out to however many other functions needed to be invoked. But this way, you're decoupling. So get current method really doesn't care what's in there because you're just returning this handle to the asynchronous operation. And as soon as get current position completes successfully, it's going to call the resolve method on that deferred object. Or if it fails, it'll call the deferred.fail. And whatever's listening or is handling, it's kind of like an event handler.
And you are 100% right. And it's just much nicer, and it gives you a lot more options in terms of code reuse.
Absolutely. Now, I haven't done a lot of, I'm not going to lie, I haven't done any unit testing in JavaScript. But it seems like this would really help out in that situation where you have that mess of code, but you need to test it and break it up.
Because now each one of these things are completely independent. So I can just set up a situation, for example, where I fire the get location. Although I don't, I haven't actually tried to unit test that. That one I don't know how it would work. You might have to mock up get current position because that relies on the actual HTML5 API. But the nice thing is if you had your own library, you can now just pass in any function you want as part of the then statement, which gets called when you do resolve. So it makes it much easier to unit test this for sure.
This is really great, and hopefully we can see more people starting to write JavaScript in this way.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one pattern that I really, really like. But I did want to show one quick thing, and that's, so we looked at how this works within jQuery, but I wanted to show a different way, which is using AngularJS. So I did talk about where I got this particular deck from. It's from my good friend Locke. He runs the AngularJS OC user group, which is an awesome, awesome user group. If you're in the area, you should go check it out. But what's super cool too is the actual code base for this is a really good AngularJS example, and he does use things like promises in his code. So let's look at this one service he got. So he has an actual service here called a GeoService. Services in Angular are basically utility objects that can be shared between different components of your system. So it's an actual service. He basically builds a deferred object here, and I guess I should explain what this service does. So this is a Google Maps service And what he's done is he's basically wrapped the Google Map geocoder API into an object that he can consume within his AngularJS app. And if we look at this get geocode or this geocode address function, he's basically using a deferred object here. But notice this is using $q.defer. This is different from what we looked at before because this is how Angular does it. You can also resolve, so that works fine. But look at the return type here. In jQuery, we returned a promise function, whereas here we're just returning an actual object. So there's a little bit of differences I wanted to point out. And once again, if you wanted to to look at this, you have to go to the AngularJS OC site and go look at the actual deck, which Dustin is going to link to.
Thanks, Hatan, for the demo. You can follow Hatan on Twitter @Hatan, and you can visit his blog mvc.net.wordpress.com. And Hatan wants me to share the Promise Spec URL with you and also the URL for the slide deck that he was using. Okay, that's it for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and Bitcast, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and visit codeporn.com when you have nothing better to do. See you next time.